All right, let's just jump right in. We spend so much time, I mean, countless hours, designing lessons to fill our students' heads with knowledge. But what about their hearts? What about the part of learning that really drives them? Their values, their motivation, their attitudes? It's this huge paradox, isn't it? It's something educators have been wrestling with for decades. We all know it's absolutely essential, but it just keeps getting pushed to the side. So in this breakdown, we're going to tear into the peer-reviewed evidence on what's called the affective domain. We're going to find out why it's been so overlooked and, more importantly, how we can finally start teaching it the right way. So here's our game plan. First, we'll get into what this forgotten domain is all about. Then, we'll look at Krathwohl's hierarchy, that's our foundational thesis. After that, we'll explore the implementation paradox, which is basically all the real-world problems that serve as our antithesis. And then we'll see how a breakthrough in measurement gives us a powerful synthesis, which will lead us straight to the big takeaways and some concrete action points you can use right away. Okay, so to really get the affective domain, you first have to see where it fits in the grand scheme of things. For a long time now, education has been broken down into 3 big areas: the cognitive domain for the head, the psychomotor for the hands, and the affective domain for, you guessed it, the heart. The cognitive domain? That's our bread and butter. It's all about knowledge, thinking, problem solving. It's what we test constantly. But the affective domain, well, that's about feelings, values, and motivation. And as one researcher perfectly put it, it's often seen as the most nebulous and the hardest to evaluate. And that right there, that difficulty in measuring it, that's exactly why this incredibly crucial domain has been pushed to the back burner for so long. So how in the world do you bring structure to something as messy as feelings and values? Well, that was the exact challenge that David Krathwohl, Benjamin Bloom, and Bertram Macià took on way back in 1964. They came up with a foundational framework, our thesis for today, to try and make sense of it all. And their core finding was huge. They created a 5-level hierarchy built on this really powerful concept called internalization. The whole idea is that our values don't just pop into existence. We actually develop them through a pretty predictable process. Now, even they admitted that the domain is hard to measure, but the impact of this framework? Massive. It gave us the very first real map for the heart. So what is internalization? Well, think of it as the journey from just being aware of an idea to that idea becoming a deep part of your character. It all starts at receiving, where a student is basically just willing to pay attention. Then they move to responding, where they're actively participating. At valuing, they start to see the worth in the idea. Then comes organization, where they begin to fit this new value in with all their other ones. And finally, you get to characterization, where the value is so baked in that it just naturally guides their behavior. It's a really clean, logical progression. But, and you knew there was a but coming, here's where things get tricky. A logical map is fantastic in theory, right? But what happens when you try to use that map in the messy, unpredictable territory of a real classroom? And that brings us to our antithesis, the research that really calls this neat little model into question. So, a 2025 study by Acosta and San Diego looked at 300 PE students. They wanted to see if teaching style, like direct instruction versus a more hands-off, discovery-based approach, actually made a difference in developing effective traits like teamwork or grit. And their core finding was a real shocker. No significant difference. Let that sink in. It didn't matter if the teacher was explicitly telling students what to value or letting them figure it out on their own. The outcomes in the affective domain were, statistically speaking, the same. This just throws a giant wrench in the idea that there's some simple formula we can follow to teach values. And this just leads to a massive question. Is Krathwohl's map just wrong? Or have we been missing a huge piece of the puzzle this whole time? The study kind of hints that the problem might not be with the teaching itself, but with our historical inability to actually measure the results accurately. And that, right there, brings us to our synthesis. For more than 50 years, the entire field was basically stuck. But some very recent research has given us a new compass, a breakthrough that finally tackles the domain's oldest and biggest problem head-on. Okay, so in 2023, researchers at Griffith University developed something called GWALS, the Griffith University Affective Learning Scale. By analyzing students' reflective journals after emotionally significant experiences, they discovered they could reliably and quantitatively measure affective growth. The impact score here is a solid 5 out of 5 because honestly, this changes everything. I mean, just think about that for a second. The single biggest reason this domain was called nebulous and was overlooked for half a century was this core belief that you just couldn't measure it objectively. The GCOS study didn't just poke holes in that belief, it completely shattered. This is the number that signals a massive paradigm shift. The study hit an intra-class correlation coefficient of 0.86. Now, if you're not a stats nerd, all you need to know is that this shows an incredibly high level of agreement between different people rating the same thing. It is hard data that proves we can, in fact, reliably assess learning in the heart. The problem was never that it was impossible, it was that we just didn't have the right tools for the job. Okay, so let's put all these pieces together. We've got a foundational theory, a real-world practical challenge, and a modern breakthrough. How do they all fit? Well, welcome to the data war, where all this research collides. So here's the bottom line. Everybody agrees that the affective domain is critical. That's not up for debate. The disagreement is all in the how. Krathwohl gave us this neat straight line, but the Acosta and San Diego study showed us that the real world is a lot messier. One teaching style didn't magically produce a specific outcome. And the reason for this conflict is that methodological gap. Krathwohl's work was conceptual, Acosta's was applied, and both were hamstrung by the lack of a good measurement tool, a problem that Wallace is now starting to fix. So what does all of this actually mean for you in your classroom on a Monday morning? Let's boil this whole complex debate down into 3 clear, unifying takeaways. First, start thinking of Krathwohl's hierarchy as a blueprint you can use to design learning experiences, not as a rigid ladder every single student has to climb in the exact same order. Second, context is king. That Acosta study strongly suggests there's no single best way to teach values. It really depends on your subject, your environment, and your students. And third, and this is the most important one, assessment is now a solvable problem. The barrier isn't that we don't have the tools anymore, it's getting the training and institutional buy-in to actually use them. All right, let's take these big ideas and turn them into small, concrete actions. Here are 3 things you can do this week, literally this week, to start putting this research to work. First, audit one of your upcoming lessons, just one. Ask yourself, where is the opportunity for affective learning here? Am I just teaching the what, or am I also getting to the why this matters? Second, reframe one assessment question. Instead of asking, what did you learn, try asking something like, how did this topic change your perspective? See, that's a question that hits the valuing level. And finally, explicitly model one value. Tell your students, hey everyone, today I'm going to really focus on being fair in our discussion, and then go out of your way to do it. Modeling is such a powerful, even if it's indirect, teaching tool. You know, the biggest takeaway from all of this research is that teaching the heart isn't some vague, unmeasurable art form anymore. It's actually becoming a science. We finally have the frameworks and the tools to make it a deliberate, intentional, and essential part of what we do every single day. To ensure you keep receiving these research-driven pedagogic breakdowns, simply like this video and hit subscribe to Simplified Teaching right now. The next analysis drops next week. You won't want to miss it. P.S. Want to support our work? Relevant resources and affiliate links are in the description below. See you next week.